At Christmas dinner, my dad casually announced has updated his will. Everything would go to my sister since she'd actually done something with her life. My mom nodded. I just grinned, finished my plate, and left. Now, they are mad at me when they found out what I did. I, 32M, never thought a Christmas dinner could change everything, but here we are. Dad dropped his little announcement right between the mashed potatoes and green bean casserole, casual as commenting on the weather. Everything in his will was going to my sister since she'd actually done something with her life. Mom just nodded along like she was agreeing with his choice of wine. I kept eating, took another bite of turkey, chewed slowly, and grinned. They probably thought I was taking it well. Truth is, I was calculating exactly how much this was going to cost them. See, what my parents didn't know was that I'd been quietly building something for the past 8 years. While my sister was climbing the corporate ladder at her marketing firm, posting LinkedIn updates about her promotions, and buying her downtown condo, I was working nights and weekends on a little side project. Nothing flashy, nothing they'd ever think to ask about. Dad had always been vocal about his disappointment in me. I dropped out of law school, worked various jobs, never seemed to stick with anything long enough to impress him. My sister was the golden child. MBA, 6-figure salary, everything tied up in a neat, respectable package. I was the family underachiever who still lived in a rental apartment and drove a 10-year-old Honda. What they didn't realize was that I'd been developing software, specifically an inventory management system for small manufacturing companies. Started it because the warehouse job I'd taken after leaving law school had the most inefficient system I'd ever seen. Spent my lunch breaks sketching out better solutions, teaching myself programming languages at night. The first company that bought my software paid me $12,000. Not life-changing money, but enough to make me think I was onto something. The second sale was $25,000. The third was $40,000. Word spreads fast in manufacturing circles when something actually works. By year 3, I had a handful of clients. By year 5, I was making more than my day job. By year 7, I'd quit the warehouse and was running my business full-time. By year 8, 3 weeks before that Christmas dinner, I'd gotten an acquisition offer that made my head spin. But I never told my parents. Never posted about it on social media. Never bought flashy things or moved out of my modest apartment. My sister would call Mom every week with updates about her career. I'd call and talk about the weather, maybe mention picking up extra shifts at work, a convenient fiction I'd maintained even after leaving. The acquisition offer came from a company that specialized in buying small software businesses and scaling them up. They wanted my client list, my code, and my expertise. The initial offer was $2.8 million, with the possibility of earn-out payments that could push it over $4 million in the next 2 years. I'd been sitting on the paperwork for weeks, unsure if I wanted to sell. Building the business had been satisfying in a way I couldn't explain to my achievement-oriented family. It was mine. I'd created something useful, something that solved real problems for real people. Then Dad made his announcement. I finished my plate, complimented Mom on the stuffing, and told them I had some work to catch up on. Dad made a comment about me always having some excuse to leave early. I just smiled and said I'd see them soon. The next morning, I called my lawyer and told him to finalize the acquisition. The paperwork took 6 weeks to complete, but by February, the money was in my account. All of it. $2.8 million, minus taxes and legal fees, but still enough to fundamentally change my life. I didn't tell them immediately. Instead, I started making some changes. The first thing I did was buy a house. Not a mansion, not something flashy that would scream new money. A solid 4-bedroom colonial in a good neighborhood, the kind of place Dad always said I'd never be able to afford. I paid cash. The realtor kept asking if I was sure I didn't want to finance it, but I liked the finality of owning something outright. The second thing was a car. Still nothing flashy. A 3-year-old BMW that looked professional but not ostentatious. Again, cash purchase. The salesman was confused but happy. The third thing was setting up proper investments. I'd learned enough about money management over the years to know that $2.8 million could either set me up for life or disappear quickly if I was stupid about it. I met with financial advisors, set up a diversified portfolio, put money into tax-advantaged accounts. Boring, responsible stuff that would compound over time. My parents didn't notice the changes at first. I still lived below my means, still dressed the same way, still drove past their house in my old Honda when I visited. The BMW stayed parked a few blocks away. I wanted to see how long it would take them to figure out that something had shifted. The first hint came in April when my sister mentioned that she was looking at houses. She'd been approved for a mortgage that would let her buy something in the $400,000 range, which she was excited about. Dad made his usual comments about how proud he was of her financial responsibility and forward planning. That's when I decided to let them know about the house. I invited them over for dinner, said I wanted to cook for them for a change. Mom seemed surprised but pleased. They probably thought I was finally getting my act together, maybe finding some domestic stability in my rental apartment. The drive to my new address confused them at first. Dad kept checking his GPS, asking if I'd given him the right location. When we pulled into the driveway of a house that was clearly nicer than anything they'd expected me to afford, I could see them exchanging glances in the rearview mirror. I met them at the door and gave them a tour. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, updated kitchen, finished basement with a home office. Everything clean, well-maintained, clearly expensive. Dad kept asking questions about rent and lease terms. I kept giving vague answers about the arrangement I'd worked out. It wasn't until we were sitting down for dinner that Mom finally asked directly how I could afford a place like this. I told them I'd bought it. Dad laughed and asked what bank had been stupid enough to give me a mortgage. I said I'd paid cash. The silence that followed was the most satisfying moment I'd had in years. Dad's first reaction was suspicion. He wanted to know where I'd gotten that kind of money. Had I taken out loans? Was I involved in something illegal? I assured him everything was completely legitimate and above board. My sister, who'd driven over separately, looked like someone had slapped her. She'd been talking for months about her house hunting process, the careful budgeting, the mortgage pre-approval. Now her underachiever brother was sitting in a house worth 3 times what she could afford, talking about paying cash like it was nothing unusual. I explained about the software business, how I'd been building it for 8 years, how I'd just sold it for enough money to buy the house outright, and still have plenty left over for investments and retirement planning. Dad's next reaction was anger. Why hadn't I told them about this business? Why had I let them think I was struggling? Why hadn't I asked for advice or help? I reminded him that he'd spent the better part of 8 years telling me I was wasting my potential, that I'd never amount to anything, that I was a disappointment compared to my sister. I asked him when, exactly, he thought would have been a good time to bring up my little side project. Mom tried to smooth things over, said they were proud of me, that this was wonderful news. But I could see the calculation in her eyes. She was thinking about the will, about the assumptions they'd made, about Christmas dinner 3 months earlier. My sister asked pointed questions about the business, about the acquisition, about my plans. I could tell she was trying to figure out exactly how much money we were talking about. I kept my answers general, but let enough slip that they'd understand the scope. The evening ended awkwardly. They were happy for my success, but clearly unsettled by how completely they'd misunderstood my situation. Dad made a few comments about how I should have trusted them with this information. I didn't point out that trust works both directions. Over the next few weeks, they started treating me differently. Dad began asking my opinion on financial matters. Mom wanted to know if I was seeing anyone, whether I was thinking about settling down now that I was established. My sister's calls became less frequent and noticeably cooler. The real drama started in May when Dad called and said he wanted to discuss updating his will. He'd been thinking about our conversation, about the success of my business, about how to divide things fairly between his children. I told him that wouldn't be necessary. I reminded him that back at Christmas, he'd been very clear about his reasoning. My sister had done something with her life, and I hadn't. That was his assessment then, and I saw no reason why his evaluation should change just because he'd learned some new information. He tried to argue that he hadn't known about my business, that the circumstances were different now. I pointed out that the business success hadn't happened overnight. I'd been building it for 8 years, which meant it existed long before his Christmas announcement. His decision to leave everything to my sister wasn't based on incomplete information. It was based on assumptions and judgments he'd made without bothering to understand my actual situation. The conversation got heated. Dad accused me of being vindictive and holding grudges. I told him I wasn't holding any grudges. I was simply holding him to the decision he'd made when he thought it wouldn't cost him anything. Mom called the next day to try a softer approach. She explained that Dad felt terrible about the Christmas dinner, that he'd spoken hastily, that they wanted to make things right. I asked her if she remembered nodding along when he made his announcement. She said she'd just been supporting her husband, that she hadn't really thought it through. I pointed out that she'd had 3 months to think it through. If she'd disagreed with the decision, she'd had plenty of opportunities to discuss it with Dad privately or bring it up with me directly. Her silence had been consent. The calls continued for weeks. Dad offered to split everything 50-50, then 60-40 in my favor. Then he suggested leaving me the house and my sister the investments. Each offer came with explanations about family harmony and moving forward together. I declined them all, not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't need their money anymore. The acquisition had set me up financially for life if I was smart about it. More importantly, I'd learned something valuable about how my parents really saw me, and I didn't want to pretend that conversation had never happened. My sister finally called in June. She was angry. She accused me of manipulating the situation, pointing out that I could have corrected their assumptions about my financial situation at any time over the past several years. She said I'd deliberately deceived them to create this drama. I acknowledged that I'd been private about my business, but I pointed out that they'd never asked. In 8 years of family gatherings, neither parent had ever inquired about my work beyond surface pleasantries. They'd been content to assume I was struggling because it fit their narrative about my choices and character. She argued that families should be open with each other, that I'd violated some implicit trust by not sharing major developments in my life. I agreed that families should be open and asked her why she thought our parents had felt comfortable making inheritance decisions without discussing them with both children first. The conversation devolved from there. She accused me of being petty and materialistic. I pointed out that I was the only one in this situation who didn't actually need the inheritance money. She hung up on me. Update 1. The situation escalated in July when I found out they'd been talking to other family members about our dispute. My uncle called to lecture me about forgiveness and family loyalty. 2 cousins reached out to say they'd heard about the drama and thought I was being unreasonable. What bothered me wasn't that they disagreed with my position. It was that the story they'd been told was completely one-sided. According to the Family Gossip Network, I was a successful but vindictive son who was punishing his parents for a simple misunderstanding about money. The part about Dad's casual cruelty at Christmas dinner seemed to have been minimized or omitted entirely. The 8 years of disappointed comments and unfavorable comparisons weren't part of the narrative. The fact that I'd been financially stable enough to help them if they'd ever asked, but they'd never bothered to ask, wasn't mentioned. I started getting invitations to family events with little notes about how everyone hoped we could work things out. The subtext was clear. I was expected to be the bigger person, accept Dad's revised will, and pretend that Christmas dinner had never happened. Instead, I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I started being completely honest about my financial situation. When my cousin mentioned at a barbecue that she was struggling with student loans, I offered to pay them off. When my uncle complained about needing a new roof but not being able to afford it, I handed him a check. When family friends mentioned postponing their daughter's wedding due to cost, I quietly covered the venue rental. Nothing huge or showy, just practical help for people I cared about who actually needed it. Word spread quickly through the family network that I was apparently wealthy enough to solve other people's financial problems without thinking twice about it. This created an interesting dynamic. Suddenly, people were very curious about exactly how much money I had. My parents, who'd been pushing for reconciliation based on the idea that I was being unreasonable about inheritance money I supposedly needed, had to confront the reality that I was giving away more money in random acts of generosity than they'd been planning to leave me in the first place. Update 2. By August, Dad was getting desperate. He'd apparently consulted with a lawyer about whether he could structure his will to force me to accept an inheritance. The lawyer had explained that you can't make someone take money they don't want, which led to a frustrated phone call where Dad accused me of being stubborn just to make a point. I told him he was right. I was making a point. The point was that actions have consequences, and words matter. When he'd announced his will decision at Christmas dinner, he'd been making a statement about how he valued his children's contributions to the family. I was simply accepting his evaluation and living according to it. He argued that people say things they don't mean when they're emotional or trying to motivate someone to do better. I asked him if he thought publicly humiliating me at a family dinner was good motivation. He said he'd just been trying to encourage me to live up to my potential. I pointed out that I'd been living up to my potential all along. He'd just never bothered to notice because my version of success didn't match his expectations. The business I'd built was profitable, ethical, and provided genuine value to my clients. I'd created something from nothing, taken risks, worked incredibly hard, and achieved financial independence by age 32. If that wasn't living up to my potential, I wasn't sure what would qualify. The conversation ended with him asking what it would take for me to forgive him and accept a revised inheritance. I told him I'd already forgiven him. Forgiveness didn't require pretending the original conversation had never happened. As for the inheritance, I genuinely didn't want or need it. He should leave everything to my sister as originally planned. Mom tried a different approach. She invited me to lunch and spent 2 hours explaining how hurt Dad was by my rejection of his attempts to make amends. She said he felt like I was punishing him indefinitely for one mistake, and it was affecting his health and peace of mind. I listened patiently, then asked her a question that had been bothering me for months. When Dad made his announcement at Christmas dinner, had she agreed with his reasoning, or had she just been supporting his decision regardless of whether she thought it was fair? She was quiet for a long time before admitting that she'd thought he was being harsh, but she hadn't wanted to contradict him in front of everyone. She'd planned to talk to him about it privately later, but then I'd left so quickly that she'd figured I wasn't too bothered by it. I asked her why she'd assumed I wasn't bothered rather than asking me directly how I felt. She said I'd seemed to take it well, that I'd smiled and finished my dinner. I explained that I'd been in shock, and the smile had been me trying to process what felt like a deliberate insult in front of the whole family. She started crying then, saying she'd had no idea I'd been hurt by the whole thing. She'd thought Dad's announcement was just typical dad behavior, maybe a little thoughtless, but not intended to be cruel. That conversation helped me understand something important. My parents weren't malicious people trying to hurt me deliberately. They were just incredibly self-absorbed people who'd never learned to consider how their words and actions affected others. Dad's Christmas announcement hadn't been calculated cruelty. It had been thoughtless selfishness. Mom's nodding agreement hadn't been a deliberate slight. It had been conflict avoidance. Understanding their motivations didn't change my position, but it did make me feel less angry about the whole situation. Update 3. The final resolution came in September, almost 9 months after that Christmas dinner. Dad had a minor heart episode. Nothing life-threatening, but scary enough to make everyone think about mortality and family relationships. I visited him in the hospital, and we had the most honest conversation we'd ever had. He admitted that he'd spent years being disappointed in me because I reminded him of himself at that age, uncertain, uncommitted, trying different things without a clear plan. He'd pushed me toward traditional markers of success because he'd worried I'd end up struggling the way he had in his 20s and 30s. I told him that his disappointment had been one of the driving forces behind my business success. Every time he'd made a comment about my lack of direction or achievement, I'd worked a little harder on my software project. In a weird way, his criticism had motivated me, but it had also made me reluctant to share my progress with him. He asked why I'd been so secretive about the business, and I explained that I'd learned not to talk to him about things that were important to me because he had a tendency to offer advice I didn't want or criticism I didn't need. The business had been mine, something I'd built without his input or approval, and I'd wanted to keep it that way. We talked about the Christmas dinner, and he admitted that he'd been trying to shock me into taking my life more seriously. He genuinely believed I was drifting without purpose, and he'd thought maybe the prospect of being left out of the inheritance would motivate me to make some changes. I told him that if he'd wanted to motivate me, he could have tried asking about my goals and plans before assuming I didn't have any. Or he could have offered help and support instead of public disappointment and shame. He apologized sincerely for the first time since this whole thing started. Not just for the Christmas announcement, but for years of making me feel like I wasn't good enough as I was. He said he was proud of what I'd accomplished and sorry he'd failed to see it happening. I accepted his apology, and I meant it. But I also told him that accepting his apology didn't mean pretending the damage hadn't been done. I'd learned some important things about how he saw me and how our family operated, and those lessons were going to inform how I related to everyone going forward. As for the will, I maintained my position. He should leave everything to my sister as originally planned. Not as punishment, but because it made sense. She had traditional expenses and obligations that I didn't. She was planning to buy a house, potentially start a family, build the kind of conventional life that required financial security and family support. I had already achieved financial independence through my own efforts. I didn't need their money, and more importantly, I didn't want the complicated family dynamics that would come with changing the will now. The inheritance issue had revealed some fundamental problems in how we communicated and treated each other. Taking money wouldn't solve those problems. Dad accepted my decision, though he clearly wasn't happy about it. Mom supported whatever we decided. My sister and I are slowly rebuilding our relationship, though it's different now. She's had to confront the fact that her supposedly unsuccessful brother had actually been more financially successful than she was. And I've had to acknowledge that my secrecy had contributed to the family's misunderstanding of my situation. The whole experience taught me that family relationships are complicated, that good intentions don't excuse thoughtless behavior, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold people accountable for their actions rather than pretending hurtful things never happened. I'm still close with my parents, but the dynamic has shifted. They ask more questions now and make fewer assumptions. I'm more direct about my boundaries and expectations. It's a healthier relationship overall, even if it's less comfortable than the old dynamic of polite fiction and unspoken resentments. The money from the business sale continues to provide security and options I never had before. I've started a new project, consulting with small businesses on operational efficiency. It's satisfying work that builds on everything I learned from the software business. Most importantly, I've learned that success doesn't always look the way other people expect it to, and that's perfectly fine. I spent years feeling like I was disappointing my family, when actually I was building exactly the life I wanted. Their Christmas dinner announcement forced me to confront that disconnect and ultimately led to better relationships with everyone involved. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and being honest about it.